was, and in fact it gets it to the exact day. And then verse 3 gives a bunch of names of Babylonians that came in. And I find that significant it's not really for my purpose or our purpose as much as it is for the world. There are records of these events in Babylonian history, and some of the names are there, and it just goes to show that the Bible just didn't reach into their version of a phone book and pull out names to stick in the Bible. They gave the names of the people who came in, and there are some, not necessarily here, I didn't double check that, but there are some records in Babylonian history that corroborate what is in the Bible. The secular history corroborates what's in the spiritual history. But we get to verse 4. Verse 4, when Zedekiah the king of Judah and all the men of war saw them, these are the ones that were coming in and sitting down right in the middle of Jerusalem, they fled and went out of the city by night by way of the king's garden through a gate between the two walls, and he went out on the Arabah. Well, when the going gets tough, the king gets going. Out he went, trying to escape. But verse 5 says he got caught, pursued them, and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. They seized him and brought him up to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. This is the same Nebuchadnezzar that Zedekiah had rebelled against. Remember, Zedekiah had put him on the throne 11 years earlier, and he thought he found his opportunity to get the Babylonians off his neck, but they caught him, and he says he passed sentence on him. Well, Jeremiah had told Zedekiah, we talked about this last week, you need to surrender. If you surrender, you can live. And what we're about to read doesn't tell us that he died, but I think he probably wished he had. Let's read on, verse 6. King of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes at Riblah. The king of Babylon also slew all the nobles of Judah. The ones that didn't surrender, the ones that stayed in the city and were fighting as much as they could, they get them in front of Zedekiah while he can still see. We'll get to that in just a second. And Zedekiah gets to see them killed right in front of him. Not a thing he can do about it. Then, verse 7, he then blinded Zedekiah's eyes and bound him in fetters of bronze to bring him to Babylon. We don't know what happened to him in Babylon. We know what happened to Jehoiachin. We looked at that, how after being in prison there for, 30-something years, he was brought out and treated like the royalty that he was, at least in Israel. But Zedekiah, this is it. We don't know any more about him. He's gone. It's almost like he was running from an army of men, he thought, but what he was really trying to do was run from the judgment of God, because God said this was going to happen. You are going to be taken captive. You're going to be taken to Babylon. But you can't run from God. Much like last week, I'm going to run through the points, and then at the end, I'll throw it open to questions, because I've got a list of things of how do we apply this to us today that I've got saved for the end. But you won't throw me off at any point if you've got any questions. Second thing, verses 8, 9, and 10, the Chaldeans burned with fire the king's palace and the houses of the people, and they broke down the walls of Jerusalem. We see natural disasters, unfortunately, all the time, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, fires. But I don't know that it can be any more destructive than when it's intentional like this is. Because if you set something on fire and it doesn't burn the way you want it to, you go back and burn it again, unlike a wildfire or something. They were determined to take them down. They took down the walls of Jerusalem. As for the rest of the people who were left in the city, the deserters who had gone over to him and the rest of the people who remained, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, carried them in exile to Babylon. So the folks that had stuff lost stuff. But look at verse 10. But some of the poorest people who had nothing, the captain of the bodyguard left behind in the land of Judah, and gave them vineyards and fields at that time. So we had houses burned and people captured, but the poor now had possession and lands. The ones that were probably the most oppressed under Zedekiah and his brother Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin wasn't there very long, now had things. Now, what they had was not the best, but they were now in possession. I have to wonder why that was done. My thinking is it's so the ones that were left behind would have a sense of gratitude to the ones that just put them in charge. But we know that didn't work with Zedekiah, didn't work with Jehoiakim. When they were put in charge by another ruler, they rebelled. So, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, verse 11, gave orders regarding Jeremiah through that, I'm not going to keep pronouncing that name, the captain of the bodyguard, saying, take him and look after him and do nothing harmful to him, but rather deal with him just as he tells you. Now, think about it from the captain's perspective. He takes orders from, I don't know if they had the same system we had, but if he's a captain, he'd take orders from majors, colonels, and generals. But he's getting an order here, you let this guy who's in Jerusalem tell you what to do. Isn't that neat? I mean, you stop to think about it, that Jeremiah's reputation preceded him to the extent that the captain was told, do what he tells you. It's not the other way around. He's going to do what you tell him. No, you do what Jeremiah tells you. So he took Jeremiah, verse 14 says, out of the court of the guardhouse and entrusted him to Gedaliah, we'll see that name again tonight, the son of Ahikam, which is a name that we've seen before. I'm not going to go through it tonight because of time, but he was one of the big dogs under Josiah. And earlier in chapter 22, you will see that Jeremiah, of the book of Jeremiah, that Jeremiah was protected by Ahikam. Not a major character by any means, but he keeps popping up. He's a somebody in the area. And he's one of the somebodies that didn't get hauled off. At least Gedaliah was one that didn't get hauled off. He went to Gedaliah's home, and he stayed there among the people. And you remember last week we had Ebed-Melech, can't pronounce it, the Ethiopian, that pulled, along with 30 others, pulled Jeremiah out of the well that he'd been thrown into. Well, his good deed wasn't forgotten either. What we're going to read in 15 through 18 reminds us of that. But the Lord said to Jeremiah, said, you go and speak to Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian. Now notice at this point, Jeremiah has already been given the run of the place. You go speak to him and says, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I'm about to bring my words on this city for disaster, not prosperity, and they will take place before you on that day, but I will deliver you on that day. Reminds me a little bit of Rahab, when the city of Jericho was going to be taken, and that she was remembered because she put the cord outside of her window, but she was going to be delivered. And he was not delivered into the hands of the men who he dread, verse 17 said. He said, I will surely rescue you. His life was spared because he trusted God, and because he had helped Jeremiah, he wasn't forgotten. So we get to chapter 40, and remember, Jeremiah can do whatever he wants to do. So he's given the choice, and instead of going to Babylon and living in an area where the king thinks well of him, he put service ahead of his personal comfort. I'm going to tell you that in my reading of this, that if Jeremiah had said, okay, I'm going to go to Babylon, he probably wouldn't have been walking. He'd probably had a horse or a mule or riding a chariot. And when he got there, he probably wasn't going to be sleeping on the ground because Nebuchadnezzar thought so much of him. But I'm summarizing here for us. He comes to him in verse 2, And notice what the captain of the bodyguard says in verse 2. The Lord your God promised this calamity against this place, and he brought it on and has done just as he promised. This is the captain of the invaders telling, just because you people sinned against the Lord and not listened to his voice, therefore this thing happened to you. But he goes on in verse 4, behold, I'm freeing you from the chains which are on your hands. If you'd prefer to come to Babylon, come along, I'll look after you. If you prefer to stay here, never mind. The whole land is before you. Go wherever it seems good and right for you to go. And he said, as he's not going back, then the captain said to him, okay, go back to Gedaliah. That's where you just need to be. Stay with him. The king of Babylon has appointed him over the cities of Judah. So we now have a governor. I'm not sure they use that word, but Gedaliah is going to be the king's emissary in that region, because imagine if you had no government at all. And I know sometimes we think that might be a good thing. But somebody's got to organize the trash pickup. Somebody's got to provide for the jails to put the miscreants in. Somebody's got to do the functions of government. And it fell on Gedaliah and some of his associates. And look at verse 5, how it ends. Captain bodyguard gave him a ration and a gift and let him go. So he goes to Mizpah, where Gedaliah, the son of Akim, stayed. Now, why do you think he's in Mizpah and not in Jerusalem? Because we just read Jerusalem had been burned and had been sacked. We see nothing here about what was going on in Mizpah, and I have to assume that that place was in better shape than was Jerusalem at that point. Now, for the rest of the chapter, we're just going to kind of hit and miss some of it. Verse 8 gives us the names of people. Verse 8, they came to Gedaliah at Mizpah along with Ishmael, and I'm not going to do the son stuff, and Johanan. Those are the two names we need to keep in mind for the rest of this lesson. He came to, verse 9, Gedaliah came and swore to them and their men, saying, do not be afraid of serving the Chaldeans. Stay in the land and serve the king of Babylon, that it'll go well with you. The same message Jeremiah had been teaching for a long time, Gedaliah is now saying it. And he says in verse 10, I'm going to stay at Mizpah to stand for you before the Chaldeans. I'm going to be your intermediary. I'm going to be your mediator, so to speak. The diplomat between us and the Chaldeans. I'm going to be that. But first things first, his first act as governor is, as for you, gather in wine and summer fruit and oil and put them in your storage village and live in your cities that you've taken over. We got to make it through this winter or summer or whatever the season was. We've got to have food. Get to it. And that's what a leader does. It tells the folks, here's what needs to be done. And in verse 11, it tells us the Jews who were in Moab and in Ammon and Edom and all the other countries, they heard that the king of Babylon had left a remnant in Judah. They appointed Gedaliah over them. Verse 12 says a lot of them came back. I've never been to Moab. I've never been to Edom. I've never been to Ammon. But for a Jew to find that to be a more desirable place than Judah was, tells me about how lousy things were in Judah before this had taken place and why God rendered the judgment on them the way he did. So, we get to verse 13, and Johanan comes to talk to Gedaliah. And in verse 14 he says, are you well aware that Balak, the king of the sons of Ammon, has sent Ishmael to take your life? But Gedaliah did not believe them. So Johanan has an answer. I've heard this rumor about Ishmael. So his answer was in verse 15, just let me go kill Ishmael, and not a man will know. Why should he take your life so the Jews who are gathered to you will be scattered and the remnant of Judah would perish? Johanan has a little bit of an insight. If Gedaliah was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar to rule over the place, and someone within killed him, you think that would please Nebuchadnezzar? Probably not. And they can see the smoldering ashes of what's left of Jerusalem, and he's thinking, we just need to take Ishmael out before anything bad happens. Gedaliah in verse 15, he was in denial. He said, do not say this thing. You're telling a lie about Ishmael. It didn't seem like either one of them considered the middle ground. Let's put a little extra guard around you, and let's just make sure you're okay. Can we do that, Gedaliah? If you won't let me go kill him, let me at least protect you to make sure we don't get the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar on us. The chapter break doesn't mean anything here. Ishmael was apparently discontented because it tells us in verse 1 that Ishmael and along with 10 men came to Mizpah where Gedaliah was. While they were eating bread together there, they're eating together at Mizpah. He and the 10 men with him arose and struck him down and put to death the one who the king of Babylon had appointed over the land. He struck down the Jews who were with him and the Chaldeans who were found there, the men of war that were there. See, they had a police force of sorts, but Ishmael did an ambush. We already know that he came into verse 8 of the previous chapter. He came to Gedaliah's presence and talked to him. It was an ambush, pure and simple. I don't know if it was from pride that Ishmael got passed over as being the governor, if it was greed. I'm going to take over this area, and even though it's a bit of a garbage dump, at least it'll be my garbage dump kind of thing. But the next day, verse 4 tells us, and again, it may be that Gedaliah, he didn't like the way Gedaliah was complying with the Babylonians, but whatever he wanted to do, he failed, as we're about to see. Verse 4, the next day after the killing of Gedaliah, no one knew about it. 80 men came from Shechem, from Shiloh, from Samaria with their beards shaved and their clothes torn. And they had grain offerings and incense to bring to the house of the Lord, which I'm assuming at this moment was in the Mizpah area because the temple had been taken out. Ishmael came, no, wait a minute, maybe they were going to Jerusalem. He came out from Mizpah to meet them, weeping as he went. And he said to them, come to Gedaliah. As soon as they came inside the city, they slaughtered them and cast them into the cistern. So we had not a number for the first bunch, but we get 80 on top of whatever was killed back in verse 2 and 3. These guys are on a killing spree. You know, Johanan's advice back in chapter 40, verse 15 looks better all the time, doesn't it? Let's just go ahead and kill him. But what happened, there were 10 men found among them who said to Ishmael, verse 8, do not put us to death. We've got stores of wheat, barley, oil, honey hidden in the field. And if you kill us, we can't tell you where it is, or we can't take you to it and show you where it is, kind of thing. So they lived. But then verse 9 says they threw in the cistern all the corpses who'd been struck down. He filled it, verse 9 finishes, with the slain. He took captive the people who were remnant of the people who were in Mizpah, the king's daughters, and all the people who were there, he took them captive. Verse 11, Johanan comes back on the scene. They heard what was going on. Verse 12, they took all the men and went to fight with Ishmael, and they found him by the great pool that is in Gibeon. Probably meant something to them, doesn't mean anything to me today. As soon as all the people who were with Ishmael saw Johanan and the commanders of the forces with him, they were glad. The people that he had taken captive were glad to see that the cavalry was coming to the rescue. Then all the people he'd taken captive turned around and came back. They didn't have enough men really to keep them from running off, and they did. Ishmael and 8 of his men went to the sons of Amnon. They took off, and that's the last we hear of him. but the people have a problem. Verse 17 says, they went back and stayed at a place I can't pronounce, which is beside Bethlehem, in order to proceed into Egypt. Because of the Chaldeans, they were afraid of them because of what Ishmael had done. They were afraid that if they didn't go to Egypt, that they were going to be slaughtered right where they were. And that's the end of chapter 41. And that's where we're going to leave it for this evening. So now, what do we do with all this today? How does this relate to our lives in 2022? I'll throw it open to questions. I've got 5 or 6 things jotted down here. Yes?
The good reputation of Jeremiah is a good example for us. And we were told in Titus that that's one of the qualifications of an elder, a good reputation.
Yeah, have a good reputation within, but also without. That's number 3 here on my list. We'll get to it in a moment. Who else has got one? Yes, Todd.
Sometimes what the Lord tells us to do doesn't make sense to us in our present circumstance, but that really shouldn't matter.
Which example or which instance of all this do you think fits that best?
One of the most obvious ones to my mind is surrender. Don't fight. Give yourself up. The Chaldeans were not known for being kind. Put yourself in their hands would be challenging.
So you're thinking probably about there's no escape from God. We got to surrender to Him. Adam tried in Genesis 3. Jonah tried in the book of Jonah. Matthew tells us in Matthew 10:30 that the very heads of your head are numbered. And why is that significant? Because how could you hope to hide from someone who can tell you how many hairs are on your head, who knows that much about you? How could you possibly think you're going to get away from them? You're not. You're not going to fool him. He knows you from head to toe. Anything else? I've got a few other points here, but I'd like to hear from you. Something you thought of that this fits us for today. Well, let's also not forget that we can't hide from God the way Zedekiah tried to sneak away and hide from the army. We're also going to have to deal with the judgment someday. Okay, second one I had is our belongings won't go with us when we die. All those people that had saved up and built all their houses and all their fine jewelry and all the things that they had that were nice in their day and time, it's gone. We can't value our stuff, our family, our jobs, anything more than we value serving God. Zedekiah, and it looks like from what we can read here, the ones that decided to stay in Jerusalem rather than surrendering the way Jeremiah told them to, lost their stuff. I don't know, can't tell, that if someone decided they were going to go surrender, if they were able to back a U-Haul up to their place, load it up, and take it with them. I don't know that. But I know those that stayed inside, if they didn't get killed immediately, they got to watch their stuff burn. Think about what Peter says in 2 Peter 3:10. The day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, in which the heavens pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. And every time I see some of those idiots, did I say that out loud? People that go and throw paint on a painting and then glue their hand to it, I'm thinking, don't they know that painting's going to burn up someday anyway? Apparently they don't know it. They're trying to bring attention to their issue, but the earth they're trying to save is going to burn up anyway. All this effort that they're putting into it, it's all going to go. But they seem to want to save the planet by throwing paint on a Monet. On a Monet, Mary. She likes Monet. Paula's point that a good reputation is invaluable. We shouldn't live our life today with the goal to cause others to speak well of us. We should live in a godly manner, and that would be the effect of the way we live. You can get folks to say good things about you, at least certain segment of the population to say good things about you. But that shouldn't be the reason that you're doing it. You should be living a godly life. We read in Proverbs 22 and verse 1, a good name is to be desired more than great wealth. And Jeremiah lived that. We know he had some property out at Benjamin. We're not sure exactly all the details, but last time we talked about how he got captured when he was going there. So he wasn't a complete pauper. But his good name, not his bank account and not his lands, is what saved him in this instance. We read in 1 Timothy 5:10 how widows are to be of good reputation. As Paul has said, elders are to have a good reputation. Those who were selected to serve tables in Acts chapter 6, were men of good reputation. And we should all strive to have that. Two others that I had. I got two others. Do you look for the easy path in life? As I said, where do you think it would have been easier for Jeremiah to live? Yeah, you got to make the journey to Babylon, but after you get there, where do you think it would be easier for him to live? He stayed behind in a devastated land with a downtrodden populace. He contrasts that with the rich young ruler who couldn't give up his things to go follow Jesus the way he was asked. Or Demas, that we read, he loved the present world so much that he stopped following with Paul, serving the Lord with Paul. We don't need to be looking for the easy way out into things. We need to do what God tells us to do and look for. Jeremiah was looking, and we're going to see that next week, or not 2 weeks, I'm sorry, how Jeremiah stayed behind with people who needed him but didn't appreciate him. And then finally, the little lesson here at the end, you handle rumors and gossips properly. When you hear a rumor that someone is out to kill you, it's probably okay to put up some security cams and maybe have yourself armed in the house. Johanan's idea was, he hadn't done anything yet, let me go kill him before he does. Gedaliah just, that can't be. Much like we talked about last week, that sometimes that when the worst was coming in World War II, people couldn't believe that it was going to get that bad. They just couldn't envision that kind of evil. Gedaliah didn't have the foresight to understand that someone might think it was in their best interest to kill him. I think about Joshua 22. When Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh were going back across the Jordan River into the lands that they were promised east of the Jordan, they didn't want to be in the promised land. They wanted their land over on the other side. And they were going back. They built a monument, pillar stones out there. And the first reaction that those that stayed on the west side of the Jordan had is, we got to go kill them. They're doing something they're not supposed to be doing. Finally, cooler heads prevailed, and they went and talked to them, and they said, well, no, that was a memorial, so you wouldn't forget that we're over here. Matthew 18, verses 15 through 18 tells us how we handle things like that. We go talk to the person, and you might think, if you go and talk to the Ishmaels of the world, it's not going to do you any good. But what if Johanan and some of his guys had gone with Gedaliah to talk to Ishmael and said, we've heard this rumor about you. What's going on? At least he would know he didn't have the element of surprise at that point, that his plan was known to others. The way we deal with each other today is, if someone has sinned against you, you need to go talk to them. If that doesn't do any good, you get someone to go with you to talk to them before you start blabbing it all over the place. There is a middle ground. Johannes was, I'll just go kill him, and Gedaliah was, oh, no, nothing's going to happen. There's a middle ground. Okay, that was the end of the lesson. We've had the bell ring. Thoughts, questions, or comments about any part of this tonight? I can stand here till the bell rings. Go ahead.
It's always good to listen to the Lord's prophet.
Yes? Remember, Todd said it's always good to listen to the Lord's prophet, and today that's the word that we have. Let's not forget, though, much like today, there were people then who were claiming to be speaking for the Lord. We didn't read it, but, we did read it last week. Hananiah was the one who was the false prophet, and Jeremiah said, you're going to die within the year, and he did. In chapter 22 or 26, I can't remember which now, one of the prophets other than Jeremiah was killed for saying the same thing Jeremiah was saying. It's not easy always to speak the Lord's word, but it's always good to be listening to it. Other thoughts? Yes.
Can I be sure that I'm saved so I go to Jesus and give him a hug and kiss?
Okay. That wouldn't be a bad thing. Any others? Okay, well then we will adjourn. Be quiet. Don't disturb.